Mama Dunny. The 7 heads are still fresh. Constable Emeka Nwachukwu's scream echoed through the sacred grove of Ogun as he stumbled backward from the ritual hut, his police uniform stained with morning dew and terror. The sight before him defied every law of nature and humanity. 7 human heads arranged in a perfect circle around a golden calabash, their eyes still open, mouths frozen in eternal screams. But this wasn't just any discovery. This was the prayer sanctuary of Prophetess Folashade Adeyemi, the most beloved spiritual leader in all of Ogun State. For 15 years, thousands had flocked to her mountain retreat seeking healing, prosperity, and divine intervention. Politicians consulted her before elections. Businessmen brought their problems to her doorstep. Desperate mothers carried sick children up the treacherous mountain path, believing in her miraculous powers. Now, as the morning sun cast unholy shadows across the ritual circle, the truth was more horrifying than anyone could imagine. Detective Inspector Adeola Bakare arrived at the scene 30 minutes later, her experienced eyes immediately cataloging the evidence. The 7 heads belonged to her missing persons cases, all members of Prophetess Folashade's inner circle who had vanished over the past 6 months. Where is the prophetess? Detective Bakare demanded, but Constable Nwachukwu could only point with a trembling finger toward the main compound. The mountain retreat sprawled across 5 acres of sacred land, with dormitories for pilgrims, a massive prayer auditorium that could hold 3,000 people, and the prophetess's private residence, a mansion that rivaled those of Nigeria's wealthiest politicians. Gardens filled with exotic plants surrounded buildings that gleamed with gold fixtures and marble imported from Italy. But today, the compound was eerily silent. No morning prayers, no healing sessions, no lines of desperate faithful seeking miracles. Detective Bakare found Prophetess Folashade in her private chambers, sitting calmly at an ornate prayer altar as if nothing had happened. At 62 years old, she remained strikingly beautiful, with smooth, dark skin that seemed to glow with inner light, silver-streaked hair braided into an elaborate crown, and eyes that had convinced thousands they held divine wisdom. "My daughter," the prophetess said without turning around, her voice melodious and hypnotic as always. "You have come seeking truth, but are you prepared for what truth demands? Ma, you are under arrest for the murder of 7 people. Detective Bakare announced, her hand resting on her service weapon. Prophetess Folashade finally turned, and her smile was radiant, peaceful, and utterly terrifying. "Murder?" She laughed, the sound like silver bells in the morning breeze. "My child, I have given life, not taken it. Those 7 souls were offerings to ensure the prosperity of thousands. Their sacrifice feeds the river of blessings that flows to my faithful followers." Detective Bakare had seen many criminals, but none who spoke of mass murder with such serene conviction. "Ma, those were human beings. People who trusted you. People who chose to ascend to a higher purpose." The prophetess interrupted, rising from her prayer mat with fluid grace. "Chinedu the accountant, who embezzled from 3 churches before coming to me. Ngozi the traitor, who poisoned her business partner for a government contract. Tun the politician's son, who raped 4 young girls but escaped justice through his father's connections." Detective Bakare felt ice in her veins. The prophetess knew details about the victims that hadn't been released to the public. "How do you know these things?" "Because I see all, my daughter. The divine reveals the true nature of every soul that enters my sanctuary. These 7 carried such darkness that their deaths became doorways to divine power." The prophetess moved toward an elaborate shrine filled with golden artifacts, precious stones, and objects that seemed to pulse with their own energy. "For 15 years, I have channeled power beyond mortal understanding. Barren women have conceived children. Terminal cancer patients have walked away healed. Businesses worth millions have been saved from bankruptcy. But power demands payment, and the payment must match the blessing requested. You're talking about ritual murder." Detective Bakare's voice cracked with disgust. "I'm talking about divine economics," the prophetess replied calmly. 7 lives to save 7,000. 7 souls to purchase prosperity for 70,000. The mathematics of spirituality are precise, my child. At that moment, Detective Becare's radio crackled with urgent reports from the compound search teams. Detective Becare, you need to see what we found in the basement. There are rooms full of personal belongings. Hundreds of items from people who've been here over the years. As backup officers moved to arrest the prophetess, she offered no resistance, but spoke one final, chilling prophecy. You think you have discovered evil, but you have only glimpsed the shadow of divine justice. The 7 who died were chosen for their crimes. But there are others whose time of judgment approaches. The harvest of souls has only begun. The morning that had started with the discovery of 7 severed heads was becoming a nightmare that would expose the darkest secrets of spiritual manipulation, ritual murder, and the terrible price of false prophets. What other horrors will they discover in the prophetess's compound? How many more victims are there? Don't miss the shocking revelations in next chapter. Hit that like button and subscribe to uncover the terrifying truth behind Nigeria's most trusted spiritual leader. Detective, you need to see the basement. Now, Officer Kemi Oladapo's voice trembled through the radio as Detective Becare finished processing the arrest of Prophetess Folashade. The spiritual leader sat in the back of the police van, still radiating that unsettling calm, her lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayers. The basement of the main compound had been hidden behind a false wall in the prophetess's private study. As Detective Becare descended the stone steps, the smell of incense couldn't mask an underlying odor that made her stomach turn. The sweet, cloying scent of decay mixed with expensive perfumes. What she found defied comprehension. The basement was divided into 7 chambers, each one a grotesque shrine to different aspects of human greed and desperation. The first chamber was filled with baby clothes, tiny shoes, and hundreds of pregnancy tests, all belonging to women who had sought the prophetess's help to conceive children. We found medical records, Officer Oladapo reported, holding up manila folders with shaking hands. The prophetess was selling newborn babies to wealthy families across West Africa. She convinced barren women they were receiving miraculous pregnancies, then sold their babies and told the mothers the children died during delivery. Detective Becare felt sick. How many babies? The records go back 12 years. At least 300 confirmed sales. The second chamber contained business documents, contracts, and bank statements showing the prophetess's involvement in a massive money laundering operation. Politicians, oil executives, and international businessmen had been funneling millions through her spiritual offerings, using religious donations to clean dirty money. But it was the third chamber that revealed the true scope of her evil. Hundreds of personal items filled the room. Jewelry, watches, family photographs, identity cards, car keys, and clothing. Each item was labeled with dates and cryptic notes in the prophetess's handwriting. These belonged to missing persons cases going back 15 years. Detective Becare realized with growing horror. Not just the 7 victims we found. Hundreds of people. Officer Oladapo picked up a child's school uniform. The name Chioma Akoli, age 8, written on the label. Detective, this girl went missing 3 years ago. Her family spent their life savings paying the prophetess to help find her through divine revelation. The cruel irony was devastating. The prophetess had been taking money from families to find people she had already killed. Meanwhile, news of the arrest was spreading across Nigeria like wildfire. Outside the mountain compound, hundreds of the prophetess's followers were gathering, refusing to believe their beloved spiritual mother could be guilty of such crimes. "She healed my daughter's blindness," shouted Mama Rashida, a trader from Lagos who had driven through the night when she heard the news. "My child sees because of Prophetess Folashade's prayers. My business grew from nothing to millions after her blessings," added Alhaji Musa, a wealthy contractor. "This is persecution of the righteous." The crowd was growing larger and more agitated. Many had invested their life savings in the prophetess's various spiritual programs. Others credited her with saving their marriages, healing terminal illnesses, or providing miraculous solutions to impossible problems. But inside the compound, each new discovery painted a more horrifying picture. The fourth chamber contained a sophisticated medical facility where the prophetess had been performing illegal organ harvesting. Kidney dialysis machines, surgical equipment, and preservation units suggested a thriving black market in human organs. She was telling families their loved ones died from spiritual attacks. Officer Oladapo pieced together from the medical records, then selling their organs to private hospitals across Europe and America. Detective Baker's phone buzzed with a call from her supervisor, Commissioner Adebayo Ogundimu. Baker, this case is exploding across social media. Half the country thinks you've arrested Saint. The other half is demanding immediate execution. I need you to build an airtight case because every politician, judge, and media house in Nigeria has connections to this woman. Sir, we're still discovering the extent of her crimes. This goes beyond ritual murder. We're looking at human trafficking, organ harvesting, money laundering, baby selling, and systematic fraud on an international scale. How international? Detective Baker looked at documents scattered across the evidence tables. Bank statements showed transfers from accounts in London, Dubai, New York, and Johannesburg. Shipping manifests detailed regular cargo flights to Switzerland and Singapore. She's been running a multinational criminal enterprise disguised as a religious ministry. The ritual murders were just one branch of her operation. In the fifth chamber, they discovered the prophetess's most diabolical scheme. Thousands of photographs showed her with government officials, business leaders, and international diplomats. But these weren't friendly meetings. They were blackmail operations. She was secretly recording everyone who came to her for spiritual help. Detective Baker realized. Politicians confessing to election rigging, businessmen admitting to tax evasion, judges revealing which cases they planned to throw. She had compromising information on half the power structure of West Africa. The evidence suggested the prophetess had been using spiritual consultations as cover for gathering intelligence that she then sold to foreign governments, business competitors, and criminal organizations. But the discovery in the sixth chamber would change everything they thought they knew about the case. What shocking secret lies in the sixth chamber? How deep does this conspiracy go? Are there more powerful people involved? Smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to discover the international conspiracy that will rock West Africa to its core. These aren't just local crimes. This woman has been selling African souls to the highest international bidder. Detective Baker's words echoed through the sixth chamber as she held up classified documents bearing the seals of foreign embassies, international corporations, and organizations she'd only heard whispered about in intelligence briefings. The chamber was organized like a war room, with maps of Africa marked with red pins indicating locations across 37 countries. Each pin corresponded to a spiritual center, healing ministry, or miracle church connected to Prophetess Folashade's network. She wasn't working alone. Officer Oladapo breathed, studying an organizational chart that showed the prophetess at the center of a web spanning 4 continents. This is a multinational criminal syndicate using religious institutions as cover. The documents revealed a horrifying truth. Prophetess Folashade's mountain retreat was the African headquarters for an international network trafficking in human suffering. Organs harvested in Nigeria were shipped to private hospitals in Switzerland. Children kidnapped from Ghana ended up in adoption agencies in Europe and America. Ritual items made from human remains were sold to wealthy collectors in Asia. But the most shocking discovery was a leather-bound ledger detailing payments from major international corporations. Mining companies paying for spiritual cleansing of communities that resist land acquisition. Detective Baker read aloud. Pharmaceutical companies funding healing ministries that conduct illegal human drug trials on desperate patients. Oil corporations sponsoring prosperity churches that convince communities to accept environmental destruction as divine will. Officer Oladapo picked up a contract written in multiple languages. Detective, this is an agreement with a Swiss pharmaceutical company. They were paying the prophetess to test experimental drugs on her followers, using divine healing sessions as cover for medical trials. The scope was staggering. For 15 years, the prophetess had been selling access to vulnerable African populations to international corporations that wanted to exploit, experiment on, or extract resources from communities that trusted spiritual leaders more than government officials. Meanwhile, outside the compound, the crowd of supporters was growing violent. News trucks from BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera had arrived, turning the story into international headline news. "Free our mama," the crowd chanted. Government persecution of true prophecy. But their faith was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Detective Bakir's team had found the seventh chamber, and what they discovered there would shatter the devotion of even the most loyal followers. The seventh chamber was the prophetess's personal museum of suffering. Hundreds of video recordings showed her conducting the ritual murders that had funded her international empire. But these weren't quick deaths. They were prolonged torture sessions designed to extract maximum spiritual energy through pain and terror. She was selling these recordings, Officer Oladapo reported, her voice barely above a whisper. Wealthy clients around the world were paying premium prices to watch live streams of ritual murders, organ harvesting, and human sacrifice. The business model was diabolically efficient. Charge desperate people for spiritual services, murder selected victims in elaborate rituals, harvest their organs for international sale, blackmail powerful clients who attended the ceremonies, and sell video recordings to wealthy sadists who collected such material. But the most horrifying revelation came from the prophetess's personal diary, written in a mixture of Yoruba, Arabic, and coded symbols. She's been planning something called the Great Harvest, Detective Bakir translated with growing alarm. According to these entries, the 7 heads we found were just preparation for a mass sacrifice event scheduled for next week. The diary detailed plans to poison the water supply at a massive religious festival that would draw over 50,000 pilgrims to the mountain. The deaths would be blamed on a spiritual plague that required even more extreme measures to combat. She was planning to sacrifice thousands of people simultaneously, Officer Oladapo realized. The largest ritual murder in human history. Detective Bakir immediately called Commissioner Ogundamu with the urgent update. "Sir, we need to evacuate the annual Festival of Divine Healing scheduled for next Friday." The prophetess was planning mass murder on an unprecedented scale. "That festival draws pilgrims from across West Africa," the commissioner replied urgently. "Nearly 50,000 people, including government officials, traditional rulers, and international delegates. If word gets out that it was targeted for mass sacrifice." At that moment, Detective Bakir's radio crackled with an emergency report from the forensics team. "Detective, we've analyzed the 7 heads from this morning. The victims weren't just randomly selected. Each one represents a different aspect of human society: politics, business, education, religion, military, media, and traditional leadership. This was a symbolic execution designed to transfer societal power to the prophetess's spiritual authority. The pattern was becoming clear. The prophetess hadn't just been running criminal enterprises. She'd been conducting a systematic attack on the foundations of African society, using spiritual manipulation to undermine traditional institutions while building her own power base. But as news trucks began broadcasting live from the compound, something unexpected happened. Several of the prophetess's most vocal supporters began stepping forward with their own horrifying testimonies. "My son didn't die from spiritual attack," sobbed Mama Comfort, a woman who had publicly defended the prophetess for 3 years. "I just realized she took him for special prayers the week before he died. She killed my boy and made me thank her for it. My wife's cancer didn't return because of divine healing," added Chief Emeka Okafor, a wealthy businessman. "I just found medical records showing the prophetess never had cancer. She was giving my wife poison to make her sick, then healing her by stopping the poison. We paid millions for fake miracles." The testimonies created a domino effect as more victims came forward, each one exposing another layer of the prophetess's elaborate deceptions. But in her jail cell, Prophetess Folashade remained eerily calm, continuing to smile as if she knew something her captors didn't. What is the prophetess planning from her jail cell? How many more victims will come forward? Is there still time to prevent the great harvest? Don't miss the explosive revelations in next chapter. Like and subscribe to discover the international forces trying to silence this investigation. Detective Bakir, you have 24 hours to release Prophetess Folashade or face the consequences. The voice on Detective Bakir's phone was crisp, educated, and absolutely menacing. The caller identified himself as Dr. Heinrich Mueller, representing what he called international stakeholders with significant investments in the prophetess's spiritual enterprises. Sir, this is a murder investigation involving hundreds of victims, Detective Bakir replied firmly. No amount of international pressure will... Detective, you clearly don't understand the scope of what you're interfering with, Dr. Mueller interrupted. The prophetess provides spiritual services to heads of state, Fortune 500 executives, and organizations that can make countries prosper or collapse. Her arrest is creating complications. The call ended abruptly, but within an hour, Detective Bakir understood exactly what Dr. Mueller had meant by complications. Commissioner Ogundma burst into the evidence room, where Detective Bakir was cataloging the prophetess's international correspondence. Bakir, I'm getting calls from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Central Bank, and 3 different ambassadors. Apparently, arresting this woman has triggered some kind of international incident. What kind of incident? A Swiss bank just froze Nigeria's foreign currency reserves pending resolution of disputes involving a valued client. A German pharmaceutical company pulled out of a 2 billion naira medical facility project. The American Embassy is reviewing visa applications for Nigerian students studying abroad. Detective Bakir felt the pieces clicking into place. They're using economic pressure to force her release. It gets worse. The Attorney General's office just called. They're reviewing the evidence to ensure the investigation meets international legal standards. That's political speak for finding reasons to dismiss the charges. But Detective Bakir had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Over the past 24 hours, she'd been secretly copying the most damaging evidence and sending it to trusted contacts in international human rights organizations. Sir, with respect, they can't silence everyone. The evidence speaks for itself. That afternoon, everything changed when BBC News aired an exclusive report featuring leaked footage from the prophetess's private chambers. The world watched in horror as the spiritual leader calmly explained her philosophy of divine economics to Detective Bakir. The international backlash was immediate and devastating. Within hours, #ProphetessOfDeath became the top trending hashtag globally. Human rights organizations in London, New York, and Geneva called for international investigations. The African Union issued a statement condemning spiritual manipulation and ritual murder masquerading as religious practice. But the most shocking development came from an unexpected source. Cardinal Adebayo Ogunjobi, Nigeria's most senior Catholic leader, held a press conference that sent shockwaves through religious communities across Africa. For too long, we have allowed false prophets to prey on the desperation of our people, the cardinal declared. The arrest of this woman exposes a cancer that has been growing in our spiritual landscape for decades. We must ask ourselves, how many other so-called miracle workers are operating similar enterprises? The cardinal's words triggered a wave of investigations across West Africa. In Ghana, authorities raided 3 spiritual centers connected to the prophetess's network. Senegalese police discovered organ trafficking operations at 2 prominent healing ministries. Cameroon's government launched investigations into dozens of miracle churches that have been receiving international funding. But inside her jail cell, Prophetess Folashade seemed unconcerned by the global controversy swirling around her case. "My daughter," she told Detective Bakir during a scheduled interrogation, "you think you have exposed my crimes, but you have only revealed the appetites of those who benefited from them. Every organ I harvested had a wealthy recipient. Every child I sold had affluent parents desperate to adopt. Every ritual I performed had sponsors who paid handsomely for results. You're talking about murder and human trafficking like they're business transactions. Because that's exactly what they are, the prophetess replied with her trademark serene smile. I simply organized the supply chain more efficiently than my competitors. The demand for human suffering has always existed. I merely professionalized the service. Detective Bakir stared at the woman who could speak about mass murder with the detached professionalism of a corporate executive. Don't you feel any remorse for what you've done? Remorse. The prophetess laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a storm. My child, I feel pride. I took desperate, suffering people and gave their pain meaning. I transformed their deaths into prosperity for thousands of others. I created a spiritual economy that generated billions in wealth. At that moment, Officer Oladapo burst into the interrogation room with urgent news. Detective, we have a problem. The prophetess's followers are organizing something called the Rescue Mission. They're planning to storm the jail tonight to free her. Through the window, Detective Bakir could see crowds gathering in the streets. But these weren't just local supporters. Buses were arriving from across West Africa, bringing thousands of believers who refused to accept their spiritual mother's guilt. How many people? Intelligence estimates over 10,000, and the number is growing. They believe the arrest is persecution of their faith, and they're willing to die to free her. The prophetess's smile widened as she heard the news. You see, my daughter? Faith is more powerful than evidence. These people have experienced miracles through my ministry. No amount of forensic proof will convince them that their healings were fake or that their prosperity came through blood sacrifice. Detective Bakir's radio crackled with updates from around the compound. Detective, we're getting reports of armed groups among the protesters. This isn't just a prayer rally. They're preparing for a siege. Also, Officer Oladapo added grimly, we've intercepted communications suggesting the rescue attempt is being funded and coordinated by some of the international clients whose names appear in the prophetess's records. They can't afford for her to start naming names in court. The situation was escalating beyond a simple criminal case into something approaching civil unrest. The prophetess had built her empire so deeply into the spiritual and economic fabric of West African society that removing her threatened to collapse interconnected systems of belief, commerce, and political influence. But Detective Bakir had one more card to play. If she could survive the next 24 hours, will the armed followers successfully storm the jail to free their beloved prophetess? What explosive testimony is she planning to give that has international powers so terrified? Don't miss the siege that will determine whether justice prevails. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for the most intense chapter yet. They have rocket-propelled grenades, Detective. This is no longer a protest. It's an invasion. Major Tund Adebayo's voice crackled through the radio as military vehicles surrounded Abeokuta Central Prison. Outside the gates, over 15,000 followers of Prophetess Folashade had transformed from peaceful protesters into an armed militia determined to free their spiritual mother. Detective Bakir watched from the prison security tower as the crowd below moved with military precision. Someone with serious tactical training was coordinating the rescue operation. This isn't random religious fervor, she reported to Commissioner Ogundamu. These people have been organized, armed, and funded by professionals. The truth was even worse than she suspected. Dr. Heinrich Mueller, the mysterious caller from the previous day, was coordinating the siege from a command center established in the abandoned Lafenwa industrial complex, 2 kilometers from the prison. Alongside him were military contractors, international intelligence operatives, and wealthy clients whose names appeared in the prophetess's blackmail files. The woman knows too much, Dr. Mueller explained to his team of mercenaries. If she testifies in court, she'll expose operations spanning 4 continents and involving some of the most powerful people in the world. We cannot allow that to happen. The plan was diabolically simple. Use the prophetess's fanatical followers as cover for a professional military operation. While thousands of believers distracted security forces with their passionate protests, trained operatives would infiltrate the prison and either rescue or silence the prophetess permanently. Inside the prison, Prophetess Folashade seemed to know exactly what was happening. "My daughter," she told Detective Bakir during their morning interrogation, "do you hear the songs of my children outside? They sing because they understand divine justice better than your earthly courts. Ma, those people are being manipulated by criminals who want to silence you before you expose them." Manipulated? The prophetess's laugh was genuinely amused. "Child, I built an empire by understanding what people truly desire. Those followers aren't here because someone paid them. They're here because I gave their lives meaning, purpose, and prosperity. Their faith is authentic, even if my miracles were manufactured." Detective Bakir stared at the woman who could remain philosophical while armed conflict erupted around her imprisonment. "Don't you care that people might die trying to rescue you? Death is simply graduation to a higher existence," the prophetess replied calmly. "Besides, many of those people were already dying before they found me. Cancer patients, AIDS sufferers, victims of poverty and desperation. I gave them hope, healing, and community. If they choose to risk death to preserve that gift, their choice honors the transformative power of faith." At 2:47 p.m., the siege began in earnest. The first wave appeared to be spontaneous. Thousands of believers rushing the prison gates, overwhelming security with sheer numbers while chanting prayers and waving banners declaring the prophetess's innocence. But Detective Bakir's trained eye caught the professionals moving through the crowd. Men in civilian clothes, but with military bearing, carrying concealed weapons and communication devices, using the religious chaos as cover for tactical infiltration. "Major Adebayo, you have armed operatives mixed in with the protesters," she radioed. "This is a coordinated military operation disguised as religious rescue." "Confirmed, Detective. We've identified at least 30 individuals with advanced combat training. But with 15,000 civilians in the mix, we can't use lethal force without causing a massacre." The second wave hit the prison's eastern wall at 3:15 p.m. While security forces were focused on the main gate, explosives breached the perimeter, allowing armed teams to infiltrate the compound. Inside the prison, chaos erupted as guards tried to maintain security while protecting inmates from the violence spilling into the facility. Detective Bakir made a critical decision. "Officer Oladapo, we're moving the prophetess to the secure interview room in the basement. If they want her, they'll have to go through us." As they escorted the spiritual leader through corridors filled with tear gas and gunfire, the prophetess remained unnaturally calm. "My daughter, this violence saddens me, but it doesn't surprise me. When you threaten systems of power and belief, those who benefit from such systems will respond with extreme measures. You created this system." Detective Bakir shot back. "You built an empire on murder and exploitation." "I created efficiency," the prophetess corrected. "The murder and exploitation already existed. Wealthy people have always consumed the poor. Powerful nations have always harvested weaker ones. And desperate souls have always been willing to sacrifice anything for hope. I simply organized these eternal patterns into profitable enterprises." They reached the secure basement, just as explosions echoed through the building above. "Detective Bakir, this is Major Adebayo. The mercenaries have reached the main cell block. We estimate you have maybe 10 minutes before they locate your position." Officer Oladapo checked her weapon nervously. "Detective, with respect, why are we risking our lives to protect a mass murderer?" It was Prophetess Folashade who answered. "Because, my dear officer, I am the key to exposing a network of international criminals who make my crimes look like petty theft. The people trying to rescue me don't want me freed. They want me dead before I can testify about their operations." Detective Bakir's radio crackled with an urgent update. "Detective, we've intercepted communications between the assault team. They're not here to rescue the prophetess. They have orders to eliminate her and destroy all evidence linking her to international clients." The realization hit Detective Bakir like a physical blow. The massive rescue operation was actually an elaborate assassination plot. The thousands of faithful followers were unknowing participants in a plan to silence their beloved spiritual mother forever. "Ma," Detective Becaire said grimly, "it appears your international friends want you dead." For the first time since her arrest, genuine emotion flickered across the prophetess's face. Not fear, but what looked almost like pride. "Of course they do," she smiled. "I taught them to monetize human suffering, and now they're applying that lesson to me. It's beautifully efficient, really. Use my own followers as camouflage for my execution, then blame my death on government persecution. The perfect crime." Heavy footsteps echoed down the stairwell toward their position. Will Detective Becaire protect the woman she arrested, or let international assassins silence the key to exposing a global conspiracy? What explosive secrets is the prophetess still hiding? Don't miss the deadly confrontation that will determine who lives and who dies. Smash that subscribe button for the most shocking chapter yet. Before you kill me, let me tell you about the children. Prophetess Folashade's voice carried an eerie calm as armed mercenaries surrounded their basement hideout. Detective Becaire and Officer Oladapo stood with weapons drawn, but they were hopelessly outgunned by the international kill team. The lead assassin, a cold-eyed European man with military tattoos, raised his silenced pistol toward the prophetess. "Ma'am, you've caused enough trouble. Time to join your victims." "My victims?" The prophetess laughed, even with death inches away. "My dear boy, you work for people who have killed more children in a single day than I did in 15 years. Should I tell these officers about the pediatric organ harvesting program your employers run in Eastern Europe? Or perhaps the child trafficking network that supplies wealthy families across America and Britain?" The assassin's finger tightened on the trigger, but Detective Becaire's voice stopped him. "Wait, she's talking about evidence we haven't discovered yet. If you kill her now, we'll never find the other victims." It was a desperate gambit, but it worked. The mercenaries had orders to eliminate the prophetess and destroy evidence, but they also needed to ensure no loose ends remained that could expose their employers. "You have 5 minutes," the lead assassin said coldly. "Tell us where you hid the rest of the evidence, and we'll make your death quick." "Oh, my son," the prophetess smiled with genuine warmth. "Death holds no fear for someone who has communicated with the spirit world for decades. But I'll tell you a story that will haunt you forever." She settled back against the concrete wall, as if preparing for a casual conversation, even with multiple weapons trained on her. 15 years ago, Dr. Heinrich Mueller approached me with a proposition. His pharmaceutical company needed test subjects for experimental drugs that couldn't be legally tested on humans. Poor, desperate Africans seeking spiritual healing made perfect candidates. Detective Becaire's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. "The healing ceremonies," she whispered. "Precisely, my daughter. Every miracle healing was actually an illegal drug trial. Cancer patients receiving blessed water laced with experimental chemotherapy compounds. AIDS sufferers given Holy Communion containing untested antiretroviral drugs. Diabetics injected with divine serum that was actually prototype insulin treatments." The assassin checked his watch impatiently. "Get to the point." "The point, my violent friend, is that your employers needed those experiments to appear successful to international investors. So when the drugs killed or crippled our test subjects, we had to hide the evidence. That's when the ritual murders began, not for spiritual power, but to dispose of witnesses who might expose the illegal medical trials." Officer Oladapo looked like she might vomit. "You were killing people to cover up medical experiments. We were protecting billion-dollar pharmaceutical investments," the prophetess corrected. "Every drug that killed a dozen Africans during testing went on to save thousands of Americans and Europeans after approval. The mathematics of global healthcare are quite efficient." Detective Becaire's mind raced through the evidence they discovered. "The 7 heads we found, they weren't just ritual victims. They were whistleblowers." "Very good, my daughter." Chinedu, the accountant, discovered financial irregularities in the pharmaceutical payments. Ngozi, the trader, started asking questions about why certain patients never returned from healing sessions. Tun, the politician's son, threatened to expose us to his father unless we paid him millions in hush money. The prophetess's voice took on a lecturer's tone, as if she were teaching a university class in criminal enterprise management. Each murder served multiple purposes: eliminate witnesses, harvest organs for international sale, create ritual spectacles that reinforce my spiritual authority, and demonstrate to our international partners that we could handle security problems permanently. The lead assassin's radio crackled with an urgent message in German. After listening, his face went pale. The international press has surrounded the building. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, they're all here with satellite trucks. If we kill her now, it becomes global news within minutes. Dr. Heinrich Mueller's voice came through the radio, cold and calculated. Change of plans. We extract her alive and eliminate her somewhere more private. But Prophetess Folashade had one more card to play. "My dear international friends," she called out loudly. Knowing the conversation was being recorded, should I tell the world about the mass graves we dug in the sacred forest? The ones containing the bodies of 300 children who died during your illegal vaccine trials. Detective Bakir felt her heart stop. 300 children? Oh yes, my daughter. The pediatric trials were the most profitable. Parents brought sick children from across West Africa, believing they were receiving divine healing. Instead, they became test subjects for experimental vaccines, cancer treatments, and psychiatric medications that weren't approved for adult use, much less children. The prophetess's voice carried across the basement like a death sentence for everyone listening. The international clients paid premium rates for pediatric test subjects because children's immune systems provide better data for drug development. A dying African child represented valuable medical intelligence worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to pharmaceutical companies. Officer Oladapo was openly weeping. The missing children cases, all those families who came to you for help finding their lost kids, were unknowingly visiting the burial grounds of their own offspring. The prophetess finished calmly. I told them their children had been taken by evil spirits. In reality, their children were buried 50 meters away from the prayer altars where the parents left offerings hoping for their return. The basement fell silent except for the sound of distant gunfire and chanting from the siege above. The lead assassin spoke into his radio in rapid German, then turned back to his team. New orders. The entire operation is compromised. We eliminate everyone in this room and destroy the building. But Detective Bakir had been secretly activating her phone's recording function throughout the conversation. Every word of the prophetess's confession was being live-streamed to a secure server at police headquarters, where Commissioner Ogundamu was coordinating with international authorities. Too late, Detective Bakir said with grim satisfaction. Every word she said is already in the hands of Interpol, the FBI, and the International Criminal Court. Killing us won't silence the evidence anymore. The assassin's radio erupted with panicked voices in multiple languages as the international conspiracy began collapsing in real time. But Prophetess Folashade wasn't finished with her revelations. The most beautiful irony, she continued, her voice echoing through the basement, is that many of my followers outside genuinely experienced healing through my ministry. Not because of divine intervention, but because placebos can be remarkably effective when combined with community support and psychological validation. She gestured toward the ceiling, where the sounds of her devoted followers could still be heard. Those people risking their lives to rescue me were healed by their own faith and the power of belonging to something larger than themselves. I may have built my empire on murder and exploitation, but the healing they experienced was real, just not supernatural. Detective Bakir stared at the woman who could find philosophical meaning even in her own downfall. You destroyed thousands of lives, and you're talking about the healing power of faith? I'm talking about the paradox of human nature, my daughter. The same desperation that made people vulnerable to my exploitation also made them capable of healing themselves when they believed they belonged to a divine community. My crimes were terrible, but the community I created around those crimes generated genuine transformation for many people. At that moment, Commissioner Ogundamu's voice crackled through Detective Bakir's radio. Bakir, International arrest warrants have been issued for 17 people connected to the pharmaceutical conspiracy. Dr. Mueller and his associates are being detained at airports across Europe. The siege is ending. The mercenaries are retreating. The prophetess smiled with what looked like genuine satisfaction. And there, my dear captors, is the final lesson. Truth has its own power that transcends the individuals who speak it. I may die today, but the evidence of our crimes will live forever, ensuring that justice eventually finds everyone who participated in this enterprise. Will the international conspirators escape justice? Or has the prophetess's confession triggered a global reckoning? What other mass graves are hidden in the sacred forest? Don't miss the shocking discoveries that will change everything. Hit like and subscribe to see if divine justice really exists. We found them. All 317 children, buried in neat rows like a pharmaceutical company's inventory. Dr. Chukwuma Okoye, the state's chief forensic pathologist, delivered his report to Detective Bakare with a voice hollow from 2 days of excavating the sacred forest behind Prophetess Folashade's compound. Each small skeleton told a story of betrayal, desperation, and industrial-scale murder disguised as divine healing. The international media response was immediate and devastating. Within hours of Dr. Okoye's announcement, hashtag Prophetess of Death had evolved into hashtag Africa's Pharmagenocide, trending globally as evidence emerged of systematic medical experimentation on African children by European and American pharmaceutical companies. But the most heartbreaking discoveries were yet to come. Detective Officer Oladapo called from the excavation site, her voice cracking with emotion. We found the medical records buried with the bodies. Each child has a file detailing the experimental drugs they were given before death. Detective Bakare knelt beside a small grave containing the remains of an 8-year-old girl named Amina Hassan. Her burial shroud was a pharmaceutical company lab coat, and her grave marker was a medical chart documenting her final weeks as test subject number 247 in an experimental malaria vaccine trial. Age 8, weight 18 kilograms, died after 7 days of experimental treatment. Detective Bakare read from the water stain chart. Side effects included seizures, organ failure, and massive internal bleeding. Cause of death listed as spiritual transition during divine healing process. The systematic cruelty was staggering. Children as young as 4 had been injected with experimental vaccines, fed prototype medications disguised as blessed communion, and subjected to surgical procedures described as spiritual cleansing, but actually representing organ harvesting for international markets. Meanwhile, in her maximum security cell, Prophetess Folashade watched international news coverage of the discoveries with apparent satisfaction. "My daughter," she told Detective Bakare during their daily interrogation, "do you see how quickly the world's attention shifts from individual crimes to systemic corruption? Those children's deaths are becoming symbols of larger injustices. Ma, those children had names, families, dreams. They weren't symbols. They were human beings you murdered for money." "Of course they were," the prophetess agreed calmly. "But their deaths are exposing pharmaceutical companies that have been conducting illegal human experiments across Africa for decades. My crimes have become the key that unlocks investigations into far greater atrocities." Detective Bakare had to admit the woman was right. The discovery of the mass graves had triggered international investigations revealing a network of illegal medical trials spanning 37 African countries. Major pharmaceutical companies were facing criminal charges, government officials were being arrested for corruption, and medical regulatory systems across the continent were being overhauled. But the cost of this justice was measured in hundreds of small graves. "We found something else," Dr. Okoye reported during the afternoon briefing. "The children weren't just random victims. They were specifically selected based on genetic markers that made them ideal test subjects for particular drugs." Detective Bakare felt sick. "You're saying the pharmaceutical companies ordered specific types of children for their experiments?" "According to the medical files, yes. Children with particular genetic diseases, specific ethnic backgrounds, or certain physical characteristics were requested for different trials. The prophetess was running a catalog service, providing custom victims for specialized medical experiments. The revelation transformed the case from ritual murder to something approaching genocide: the systematic elimination of African children to advance European and American medical science. But the most shocking discovery came from an unexpected source. Chief Adebayo Aladani, traditional ruler of the local community and one of the prophetess's most vocal supporters, arrived at police headquarters with a confession that changed everything they thought they knew about the case. "I helped her do it," the elderly chief admitted, tears streaming down his weathered face. "For 15 years, I sent families with sick children to the prophetess, knowing what would happen to them." Detective Bakir stared at the traditional ruler who had been publicly demanding the prophetess's release just days earlier. "Chief, why are you telling us this now?" "Because I saw the children's graves," he whispered. "I recognize some of the names. I sent those children to die, and their parents thanked me for connecting them with divine healing." The chief's confession revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Traditional rulers, local politicians, community leaders, and even some pastors from other churches had been paid to identify families with sick children and direct them to the prophetess's ministry. "She called it community outreach," Chief Aladani explained. "We were told we were helping connect desperate families with miraculous healing. The children who died were explained as not having sufficient faith or being called home by divine will." Detective Bakir realized the pharmaceutical conspiracy had infected the entire social structure of West African communities. Trusted leaders at every level had become recruiters for medical experiments, often without fully understanding what they were facilitating. How many other traditional rulers were involved? Across Ogun, Oyo, Lagos, and Osun states, maybe 50 chiefs, hundreds of community leaders, and dozens of pastors from other denominations. The prophetess built a recruitment network that reached into every village and neighborhood. The scope was staggering. For 15 years, an entire region's leadership structure had been systematically corrupted to provide victims for illegal medical experimentation. But Chief Aladani's next revelation was even more devastating. The worst part is that many families genuinely believe their children have been healed and taken to heaven. "We convinced them that death from experimental treatments was actually divine transformation. Some parents still thank me for arranging their children's spiritual elevation." Detective Bakir understood the psychological horror of what the chief was describing. The pharmaceutical conspiracy hadn't just murdered children. It had convinced their parents that murder was a blessing, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of victimization disguised as gratitude. At that moment, Commissioner Ogundamu arrived with international arrest warrants and diplomatic cables from across Europe and America. "Bakir, 17 pharmaceutical executives are being arrested across 4 continents. The Swiss, German, British, and American governments are all launching criminal investigations. The World Health Organization is conducting emergency reviews of drug approval processes. What about the prophetess? International Criminal Court wants her extradited to The Hague for crimes against humanity. The Americans want her for international drug trafficking. The British want her for money laundering. Everyone wants a piece of her." But in her cell, Prophetess Folashade seemed unconcerned about her international legal troubles. "My daughter," she told Detective Bakir, "those governments and corporations will sacrifice me to protect themselves, but they cannot silence the questions my crimes have raised about global pharmaceutical practices. How many other African communities have been used as testing grounds? How many other traditional healers have been recruited as procurement agents? What other communities have been infected by this conspiracy? Will international justice actually reach the powerful pharmaceutical executives, or will only the African conspirators face punishment?" Don't miss the explosive international court scenes ahead. Hit that subscribe button to see if true justice can cross continental boundaries. Your Honor, the defendant sitting before this court has orchestrated the largest pharmaceutical conspiracy in human history, resulting in the systematic murder of African children to advance European medical profits. Prosecutor Elena Rodriguez's opening statement echoed through the International Criminal Court in The Hague as the world watched Prophetess Folashade's trial begin. The 62-year-old spiritual leader sat calmly in the defendant's box, wearing traditional African robes and radiating the same serene confidence that had convinced thousands of her divine authority. But today, her audience was composed of international judges, human rights observers, and media representatives from 67 countries. The case had become a symbol of Africa's exploitation by Western pharmaceutical interests. The prosecution will demonstrate that Mrs. Folashade Adeyemi operated as the African coordinator for an international network that conducted illegal medical experiments on vulnerable children, harvested their organs for profit, and murdered witnesses to maintain operational security. Detective Bakir sat in the gallery, watching the woman she'd arrested transform from local criminal to international symbol. Beside her, representatives from families of the murdered children wept as translators rendered the proceedings into Yoruba, Hausa, and other local languages. The evidence presented over the first 3 days was overwhelming. Medical records documenting experimental drug trials on children as young as 3 years old. Financial transfers showing payments from Swiss pharmaceutical companies totaling over 200 million euros. Video recordings of the prophetess explaining her divine economics philosophy to international clients. But it was the testimony of Chief Adebayo Oladunni that provided the most devastating emotional impact. "I sent 127 children to die," the traditional ruler testified, his voice breaking as he faced the families of his victims. "The prophetess paid me 50,000 naira for each child I recruited. I used that money to build schools and clinics in my community, telling myself I was trading a few lives for the greater good of my people." The defense strategy, led by prominent international human rights lawyer Dr. Aminata Traore, was unexpected and brilliant. "Your Honor, my client is guilty of the charges against her, but she is not the primary criminal in this enterprise. She is the African face of a European crime, the local facilitator of international pharmaceutical colonialism that has been exploiting African populations for decades." Dr. Traore called witness after witness who testified about similar pharmaceutical trials conducted across sub-Saharan Africa by the same companies that had funded the prophetess's operations. Dr. Heinrich Müller's company alone conducted illegal medical experiments in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, and Uganda, testified Dr. James Morrison, a former pharmaceutical executive turned whistleblower. "We estimated that African test subjects were 80% cheaper than European volunteers and 90% less likely to pursue legal action if experiments went wrong." The courtroom gasped as Dr. Morrison revealed the scope of pharmaceutical exploitation across the continent. The business model was simple: identify desperate populations seeking medical treatment, partner with local spiritual or traditional leaders who could provide access, conduct experiments that would be illegal in developed countries, and harvest valuable medical data, regardless of how many test subjects died in the process. But the most shocking testimony came from Dr. Müller himself, extradited from Switzerland after international pressure made his protection politically impossible. "The African operations were the most profitable division of our research department," he admitted under oath. "We could conduct trials that would cost 50 million euros in Europe for less than 2 million euros in Africa, with faster results and minimal regulatory oversight." Prosecutor Rodriguez pressed him for specific details. "Dr. Müller, how many African children died during your company's illegal trials over the past 15 years? "I don't have exact numbers," he replied coldly. "We didn't track individual casualties. We measured success rates and data quality. Individual mortality was considered an acceptable cost of medical advancement." The International Gallery erupted in outrage as Dr. Müller's words were translated into multiple African languages. But Prophetess Folashade's own testimony was the most chilling moment of the trial. "Your Honor, I plead guilty to all charges because they are accurate descriptions of my actions. But I want this court to understand that I was not a rogue criminal operating alone. I was a businesswoman meeting market demand created by international pharmaceutical companies and their wealthy clients." Her voice carried the same hypnotic quality that had convinced thousands of her divine authority. Every child I killed had been requested by specific pharmaceutical clients who needed particular genetic profiles for their research. Every organ I harvested had been pre-sold to private hospitals serving wealthy patients in Europe and America. Every ritual murder I performed had been designed to eliminate witnesses who might expose the international conspiracy. Judge Patricia Bensouda, presiding over the tribunal, asked the question that had haunted investigators for months. Mrs. Adeyemi, do you feel any remorse for your crimes? Your Honor, I feel profound sadness for the suffering I caused, but I also feel pride in exposing the global systems that made my crimes possible. My prosecution has triggered investigations that will save more lives than my crimes took. The prophetess looked directly at the international media cameras. I am a monster, but I am a monster created by the intersection of African desperation and European greed. My crimes were terrible, but they were logical responses to market incentives created by the international pharmaceutical industry. During cross-examination, she revealed details that sent shockwaves through international diplomatic circles. The World Health Organization knew about the illegal trials and chose not to investigate because several member nations' pharmaceutical companies were generating billions in profits from African testing programs. The Swiss government provided banking services that laundered our profits, knowing the money came from human trafficking and medical experimentation. American and British medical schools used research data generated from our illegal trials to develop treatments that are now saving lives in their countries while remaining unavailable to Africans. Each revelation triggered new investigations, diplomatic scandals, and corporate prosecutions across Europe and America. But the most dramatic moment came when Prophetess Folashade addressed the families of her victims directly. To the parents whose children I murdered, I offer no justification, only truth. Your children died to advance medical science that has saved thousands of other lives. Their deaths were unnecessary and cruel, but they were not meaningless. The investigation of their murders is exposing pharmaceutical practices that will protect other children from similar fates. Will the international pharmaceutical executives face the same justice as the prophetess, or will she become a scapegoat for a global conspiracy? What shocking verdict will the judges deliver? Don't miss the conclusion that will determine whether justice can truly cross continental boundaries. Hit like and subscribe for the most explosive finale yet. The court finds the defendant guilty on all counts, but sentences her to supervise community service rather than imprisonment. Judge Patricia Bensouda's unprecedented verdict sent shockwaves through the packed International Criminal Court. Prophetess Folashade Adeyemi had just been convicted of crimes against humanity, systematic murder, and international conspiracy, yet she would not be going to prison. The courtroom erupted in confusion and outrage as family members of victims struggled to understand how a woman who had murdered hundreds of children could avoid incarceration. Your Honor, with respect, this verdict makes no sense, Prosecutor Rodriguez objected. The defendant has admitted to orchestrating the largest pharmaceutical conspiracy in African history. Judge Bensouda raised her hand for silence, her expression grave but determined. The court has reached this unusual sentence after extensive deliberation about justice, accountability, and the most effective way to prevent similar crimes in the future. She turned to address Prophetess Folashade directly. Mrs. Adeyemi, your crimes were horrific and your victims deserve justice. However, your prosecution has exposed an international pharmaceutical conspiracy that spans multiple continents and involves some of the world's most powerful corporations and governments. The judge's next words would redefine international criminal law. This court sentences you to 15 years of supervised community service, working directly with international investigators to expose every aspect of the pharmaceutical conspiracy you helped coordinate. You will spend the remainder of your life ensuring that no other African community suffers the exploitation you facilitated. Detective Bakir watched from the gallery as the implications of the verdict became clear. Instead of disappearing into prison, Prophetess Folashade would become the key witness in potentially hundreds of international prosecutions. Furthermore, Judge Bensouda continued, the defendant's assets, estimated at over 500 million euros, will be seized and distributed to victims' families and organizations working to prevent medical exploitation of vulnerable populations. But the most shocking part of the verdict was yet to come. The court also issues arrest warrants for 247 individuals connected to the pharmaceutical conspiracy, including executives, government officials, and traditional leaders across 4 continents. Mrs. Adeyemi's cooperation will be essential in bringing these co-conspirators to justice. Dr. Heinrich Müller, sitting in the defendant's section, went pale as he realized the prophetess's sentence meant she would spend years systematically exposing everyone who had participated in the conspiracy. Over the following months, the effects of the verdict cascaded across international pharmaceutical, political, and medical establishments. In Switzerland, 3 major pharmaceutical companies faced criminal prosecution and billions in civil penalties. The Swiss banking system underwent major reforms to prevent money laundering from human trafficking operations. In Germany, government health officials who had approved data from illegal African trials were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity. In Britain, private hospitals that had used organs harvested from African victims faced closure and criminal investigation. In the United States, medical schools that had benefited from research conducted on murdered African children faced federal investigation and loss of accreditation. But the most dramatic changes occurred in Africa itself. Working under international supervision, Prophetess Folashade systematically exposed the recruitment networks that had provided victims for pharmaceutical experiments. Traditional rulers across West Africa faced prosecution. Community leaders who had accepted payments to identify sick children were arrested. Religious leaders who had referred families to experimental programs lost their positions and faced criminal charges. We estimate that over 15,000 people were directly involved in the pharmaceutical conspiracy across sub-Saharan Africa, reported Dr. Amina Hassan, the international coordinator overseeing the prophetess's community service. Her cooperation has led to the identification of similar operations in 37 African countries. The scale of pharmaceutical exploitation was far larger than we initially understood. 6 months after the verdict, Detective Bakir visited Prophetess Folashade at her supervised residence in Abuja, where she worked 12 hours a day reviewing files and providing testimony for international investigations. The woman who had once commanded a spiritual empire now lived in a modest government facility, wearing simple clothes instead of elaborate robes, surrounded by documents rather than devoted followers. "My daughter," the prophetess said, looking up from a stack of pharmaceutical trial records, "do you understand now why divine justice is more complex than human justice? Ma, I understand that your cooperation is helping convict criminals, but hundreds of children are still dead because of your choices. Yes, and thousands of other children will live because their deaths are being investigated. The pharmaceutical companies that kill my victims have been exposed and dismantled. The regulatory systems that allowed such exploitation have been reformed. The traditional leaders who facilitated such crimes have been removed from power." Detective Bakir had to admit the results were impressive. The international investigation triggered by the prophetess's case had shut down illegal pharmaceutical operations across Africa, resulted in over 400 arrests globally, and led to compensation payments totaling billions of dollars for affected communities. "But none of that brings back the children you murdered," Detective Bakir pointed out. "No," the prophetess agreed quietly, "but it ensures that their deaths contributed to protecting other children from similar fates. In the traditional spiritual system I once claimed to represent, the greatest honor comes from transforming personal tragedy into community protection." She gestured toward the file surrounding her. "I will spend the rest of my life ensuring that every pharmaceutical executive, government official, and community leader who participated in these crimes faces justice. My punishment is not imprisonment. It is the obligation to spend my remaining years confronting the consequences of my choices." Detective Bakir left the facility with mixed emotions. Justice had been served, but in ways that challenged traditional concepts of punishment and redemption. The prophetess's crimes had been horrific, but her cooperation was preventing similar crimes across an entire continent. Has true justice been achieved, or has a mass murderer escaped appropriate punishment? What final moral lesson will emerge from this complex tale of crime and consequence? Don't miss the powerful conclusion that will determine the ultimate meaning of divine justice. Hit that subscribe button for the most thought-provoking finale yet. Mama Folashade saved my daughter's life. The words came from Mama Kemi Adebayo, a widow from Ibadan whose 8-year-old daughter had been scheduled for experimental cancer treatment at the Prophetess's compound 3 years earlier. Today, she stood outside the Abuja facility where Prophetess Folashade worked under international supervision, holding a healthy child who should have died in a pharmaceutical trial. When the police arrested her, they found my daughter's name on the list for next week's medical experiments. Mama Kemi explained to the gathering crowd of journalists and human rights observers. Her arrest literally saved my child's life. It was the 5th anniversary of Prophetess Folashade's conviction, and the world was still grappling with the complex legacy of her unprecedented sentence. The woman who had murdered hundreds had become the key to saving thousands. Detective Adeola Bakare, now Commissioner of Police for Ogun State, watched the memorial ceremony from the back of the crowd. 5 years of international investigations had vindicated the controversial verdict. The prophetess's cooperation had indeed exposed pharmaceutical exploitation across an entire continent. The numbers were staggering. 47 pharmaceutical companies shut down or criminally prosecuted. 1,247 executives and officials arrested across 6 continents. $12 billion in compensation paid to affected African communities. 300,000 children removed from dangerous experimental programs. Complete reform of medical regulatory systems across 37 African nations. But the most profound changes were cultural and spiritual. Chief Adebayo Aladuni, the traditional ruler who had confessed to recruiting victims for the prophetess, now led an organization dedicated to protecting communities from exploitation disguised as spiritual help. We learned that desperation makes people vulnerable to those who promise divine solutions to earthly problems, he told the memorial gathering. The prophetess's crimes taught us to question miracle workers who demand payment, secrecy, or blind faith. The memorial ceremony was taking place at the site of the former spiritual compound, which had been transformed into a research center dedicated to ethical medical practices in Africa. The prayer auditorium, where thousands had once sought miracles, now hosted conferences on preventing medical exploitation. Dr. Amina Hassan, who had overseen the prophetess's community service for 5 years, delivered the keynote address. Folashade Adeyemi represents the darkest aspects of human nature: greed, manipulation, and willingness to exploit vulnerability for personal gain. But her prosecution also represents the power of truth to expose systemic injustice and create positive change. The audience included victims' families, international investigators, pharmaceutical reform advocates, and traditional leaders from across West Africa. Many had traveled hundreds of miles to participate in the complex ceremony of remembrance, justice, and renewal. But the most dramatic moment came when Prophetess Folashade herself addressed the gathering. Now 67 years old, she appeared fragile and aged beyond her years. 5 years of confronting the consequences of her crimes had stripped away the radiant confidence that had once convinced thousands of her divine authority. I stand before you as someone who perverted the sacred trust between spiritual leaders and vulnerable communities. She began, her voice no longer hypnotically powerful, but simply human. I used people's faith as a weapon against them, turning their hope into a tool for exploitation and murder. No amount of cooperation with international investigators can restore the lives I destroyed or heal the trauma I inflicted. She paused, looking across the crowd that included parents whose children she had killed. But I have learned that redemption is not about escaping consequences. It is about dedicating your life to preventing others from making similar choices. For 5 years, I have worked to expose every person, institution, and system that enabled my crimes. The prophetess gestured toward a memorial wall containing photographs and names of her 417 confirmed victims. These children and adults died because I chose greed over compassion, power over service, and deception over truth. They cannot be brought back, but their deaths have become the foundation for protecting countless others from similar fates. She revealed her final contribution to the cause of justice. Today, I am announcing the creation of the African Medical Ethics Foundation, funded by my remaining assets and dedicated to ensuring that no community is ever again exploited by pharmaceutical companies, spiritual charlatans, or traditional leaders who prioritize profit over people's welfare. The foundation would train community leaders to recognize medical exploitation, provide legal support for victims of pharmaceutical abuse, and monitor international medical research conducted in Africa. But perhaps the most powerful moment of the ceremony came from an unexpected source. Amina Hassan, the daughter of one of the prophetess's early victims, had grown up to become a medical doctor specializing in ethical pharmaceutical research. Now 23 years old, she addressed the woman who had orphaned her 15 years earlier. "Mama Folashade, you killed my mother during one of your fake healing ceremonies. For years, I hated you with every fiber of my being." The crowd held its breath as the young doctor continued. "But your cooperation with international investigators led to reforms that will protect millions of people from pharmaceutical exploitation. My mother's death contributed to creating a system that makes such crimes much more difficult to commit." Dr. Amina Hassan's next words would be quoted in ethics textbooks for decades to come. "I cannot forgive you for murdering my mother, but I can acknowledge that your punishment, spending your life confronting your crimes, has created more justice than your death or imprisonment would have achieved." As the ceremony concluded, Detective Bakir reflected on the moral complexity of the case that had defined her career. The prophetess had been a monster who murdered hundreds of innocent people, but she had also become the key to exposing and dismantling an international system that had been exploiting African communities for decades. Traditional concepts of justice, punishment, imprisonment, or execution would have silenced the testimony that saved hundreds of thousands of other potential victims. Instead, forcing her to spend her life confronting the consequences of her crimes had created a form of restorative justice that protected entire communities. The final lesson was perhaps the most important. Divine justice, if it existed at all, was not about supernatural retribution, but about the human capacity to transform tragedy into protection, crime into community healing, and individual accountability into systemic reform. As the sun set over the memorial site, families of victims, survivors of exploitation, and advocates for justice stood together in a complex ceremony of mourning and hope. The prophetess's crimes had been horrific, but their exposure had created a legacy of protection that would extend far beyond her lifetime. In the end, perhaps that was the most profound form of divine justice possible, ensuring that the deaths of innocents ultimately served to protect other innocents from similar fates. The story of the prophetess with 7 heads teaches us that true justice sometimes requires choosing protection of the future over punishment of the past. What moral lessons will you take from this complex tale of crime, consequence, and redemption? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more African folktales that challenge our understanding of right, wrong, and the complex nature of divine justice.